So death at sea. I think we'll focus on the age of sail to start with. I think it's a fascinating topic of it involves so much expedition and conflict. Can you just talk a little about the unique experience of sailors during the age of sail?
I think it's really interesting because during the age of sail, there's such uncertainty and there's such promise when people involve themselves in nautical travel. You have the opportunity to make yourself and to further your country. But at the same time, the dangers are immense. And one thing I've certainly encountered kind of reading for today is that, you know, that there are so many dangers, and the people who are involved in these voyages are keenly aware of those dangers as well. And they're very aware of how close they are to death and injury. And it's really fascinating because I think in some ways it's a period where we start to see the world is becoming slightly smaller, but actually there's a sort of a terrifying enormity to the sea at this time. It's full of uncertainties and dangers, far more so than the land, which, you know, many on land who live their whole lives on land would consider, you know, 18th century, 17th century England to be a place of tremendous dangers on the open road. But at sea, there are so many more. And I think it's a place where people, particularly people when they're contemplating their end and they're thinking about their life and what they expect from their life, they are faced by, if anything, the kind of the small size of their own existence in a larger universe, and a universe where their God, if you like, is very close to them. And it's a fascinating space for that reason, I think, because a lot of the certainties of life on land are not present, but the people who find themselves in these spaces create a sort of order that kind of guides them through that unknown land.
Let's just talk a little about the hazards. This has just sprung into my brain. When I was doing my PhD in the first year, I came across, this is a long, long time ago now, I came across some surgeons' journals in the National Archives, and there are not many of them. There were just a handful of them, and they record accidents at sea. And I loved it because there were so many of them. You'd think people would be falling from aloft, and yes, there were examples of that. The amount of sailors that fell down hatchways or dropped cannonballs on their feet. Well, there's another one of my favorites. So anyway, very painful. That probably didn't kill them. It might have broken their ankle. But even just a glimpse at a few of those surgeons' journals made you realize the dangers. Let's just talk about, let's kind of lay them out for our listeners about the dangers of being at sea. I'll start. The dangers of working aloft. There's one for you.
Well, working aloft is fantastic. I think, you know, even in the security of the ship itself, you know, the dangers of disease and contagious disease that, you know, you might be familiar with from land, but on a ship it can spread quickly, and there's a real uncertainty to, you know, who will survive, who won't survive. And of course, the loss of every individual there places further stress on the crew. And then, of course, you've got the dangers from without as well. You know, you have the risk of storms, you have the risk of enemy action, and those things are kind of incursive threats that kind of threaten you within the safety of your ship. And then I think there's even smaller things, you know, that there are those kind of everyday accidents that people who are engaged in kind of laboring activities face, you know, injuries, which can be quite small, you know, sort of physical injuries, contusions, burns, but things which can cycle out of control and become very threatening to a person who's, you know, a long way from help and is maybe at the mercy of someone who doesn't have the full breadth of medical experience either.
Yeah, I think if you go on a square-rigged ship even now, it becomes incredibly clear just how dangerous they are. There's a lot of very heavy stuff going on. The ship then moves in all sorts of different dimensions, and you've also got the world above you. I mean, I walk around and usually there's not much above me. There might be a tree if I'm taking my dog for a walk, but there isn't this kind of colossal rigging which is immensely heavy, and it's populated a lot of the time by people who can drop stuff on you. They can fall, and you know, it's an incredibly dangerous three-dimensional environment, and I think it made people really alert to their fears and their insecurities.
Definitely. And I think it you know, like you say, there's this very immediate threat to people who are on ship of being quite suddenly hit by something or struck by something and, kind of wiped out. Maybe if someone drops a hammer from height, or if someone drops any kind of tool really from height, if you get struck by that, that could be a suddenly fatal blow. And that's a lot to think about, really. If you're kind of if there's those day-to-day threats are coming at you from so many different angles, and you're in a way that kind of makes you very dependent on the people around you. Everyone kind of depends on everyone else to do their bits, but when everyone's kind of working, when everyone's busy in such a three-dimensional environment, those risks can become greater than the mitigations for those risks as well. And I think that's something which you definitely don't really find on land in this period. You don't find that kind of sudden uncertainty, the feeling that you might suddenly be wiped out of existence by something, because terrestrial life is quite static in that respect. There's not, like you say, there's not much going on above you. You might have a lightning storm, or you might have someone might be working on a roof, but those things are quite rare, and they're far less certain to happen than they would be if you were at sea.
Yeah, if you kind of reduce it to the most basic thing, even standing up at sea is dangerous, and you can't take it for granted. And there's also this whole question, I was talking about surgeons, but the whole questions of medicine, of course. I mean, you might, as you said, get a burn or a contusion or something, but that might kill you, especially if you're in the tropics. So you can have a very, what we would consider a minor ailment, but it could spell the end.
Definitely. And it's one of those real concerns as well, because particularly in the period that I look at, a lot of the medical provision is based around what people themselves buy and bring on the ships as well. So you're really at the mercy of what your sort of medical specialist is able to bring on board, and how survivable some of those things will be as well, and how much of them there'll be left if you're traveling long distances. So after a time, those risks can increase, and like you say, going into the tropics becomes a risk as well. And I think certainly from some of the things I've read, there's quite an acute awareness that when you move from one climate to the other, those risks can change quite dramatically, and you can be quite unprepared for some of the risks which occur when you shift from maybe a familiar climb into a less familiar climb. And that can be quite damaging for a crew if they suddenly lose lots of people, if illness takes hold and it's an unfamiliar or tropical illness that people aren't prepared for. That you can start to lose important members of your crew around you, and then those risks start to increase as well when the unfamiliar people start taking over those responsibilities.
That's interesting. I also suspect it would make the general population who've had more experience in the maritime world than perhaps we do today, being more empathetic to those suffering from grief. So more people will have suffered from grief because more people will have known more people who had been at sea. It seems to have been something that we've now grown out of. Do you agree with that?
I think so. I think there's there's certainly a sense that these are people who understand, a shared sense of loss and a sense of the precarity that comes with, ever-present death and the risk of ever-present death. And I think, in a way, traditionally, maybe there was a sense that when people experience death frequently, it makes them sort of hardened to death. But I think the reality is, that these people, in fact, have a keener sense of that loss, and they have a very personal sense of the loss of others as well through their own experiences, whether that's seeing people on board the ship who they know who've died, or whether it's families on land who know of friends or family members who've passed as well. There's a sense that it's almost like a shared community. It's a very broad kind of shared community of people who have that same shared experience, whether it's transferred through written or spoken means, or even through memorials as well.